Hi, I'm Xenia, author of these books, and today we're going to be talking about how to make a rough draft of your novel. Last week we talked about creating a detailed outline of your story. And now it's time to add some meat to those bones. This process is very simple, but far from easy. If you haven't already, now's a great time to start writing a few practice scenes from your characters' points of view. I recommend choosing scenes that aren't going to be in the book, but that were formulative moments for those characters prior to the story. It's our experiences that make us who we are. So if you want to get into your character's voice, it's a good idea to visit the moments that shaped them. This is also a good time to start building a reference. Myself, I use a World Anvil wiki for this most of the time, but a well-organized notebook, a OneNote document, even a Word document is good. I favor any method that has a search function. In this document, you'll want to start noting all the details you can about your characters, your setting, your magic systems, anything else. And having an easy-to-reference guide will help you avoid mistakes like having a uniform be red in one chapter and yellow in another. These kinds of continuity errors are easy to avoid if you have some kind of reference. So, to write your rough draft, you want to revisit your outline. You want to begin at the beginning and write the scene described. Then write the next scene described, and continue until you've written all scenes. Simple, right? But so far from easy. So what makes this process difficult? In my experience, it's fatigue, story weakness, and hopelessness. Books are long. Like, really long. It can take an insane amount of hours to write a short novel. As with most long projects, enthusiasm's going to come and go. And sometimes it can feel impossible to sit down and write another few hundred words. At times, it just feels endless. And let's be honest, after weeks of working on the same story, it can be really tempting to jump ship to a new idea that's calling you now. So here are some tips that I've used in the last 10 years to deal with writing fatigue. At one time or another, all of these have worked to get me sitting down and writing. The number one most successful thing I've tried is to schedule a writing time. I used to wake up early, wrap up in a cozy blanket, get a nice warm drink, and sit down and write for 45 minutes at 6 a.m. every day. I kept a log of how many words I wrote each session to keep myself accountable. And if I missed a day, I'd note in the log why. I didn't keep a word goal in mind, I simply logged to make sure I sat down and did it. Some mornings I did just sit there and do research or planning. And that was okay. But the important thing is I sat down and I wrote. I treated it like a job and not a hobby. Something else that's been a game changer for me is just writing one sentence. Write enough single sentences and you will eventually get a book. So why not say, hey, for me, because I love myself in this book, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write one sentence. You'll be surprised how much might end up on the paper once you have a little bit of momentum. And if you sit down and you don't feel that spark, that's okay too. You're one more sentence closer to your book. Remind yourself that it doesn't have to be good. I have a quote from Shannon Hale blown up on a big poster on my wall, and it says, "I'm putting sand in a box so that later I can build castles." And that's exactly the attitude I try to take with a rough draft. You can make it good later, but you cannot edit something that doesn't exist. Sometimes taking the pressure of perfection off your shoulders is all you need to really get going. If you're finding that difficult, try opening a new Word document and starting where you left off, but it's not part of your main story, it's in a different document. It's amazing how sometimes that just affects the psychology of it. In my experience, one of the biggest killers of writing motivation is a weak scene. I can't count the number of times I've dreaded writing a scene, and then when my partner asked me why, I kind of just answered that it's boring. And if it's boring for the writer, it's definitely boring for the reader. Another sign you might have a weak scene is if you arrive at the scene and you don't know what's supposed to happen. This is more acceptable if you're a pantser, but if you have an outline and you still don't know what's supposed to happen, that's a red flag. And you might have a story weakness on your hands. The following are common signs of a weak scene. The scene is boring to write. Even scenes that are meant to describe a boring event, person, or setting shouldn't actually be boring to read. The character should be bored, not the reader. and by extension, not the writer. So how do you fix it? The turn it off and on again of writing is to try changing the weather in a scene. This doesn't always work, but it is far more effective than it has any right to be, and it's a relatively quick and easy thing to try first. This method forces you to pay more attention and add more details, which can be just enough to push a scene over the edge from boring to interesting. My second tip is to ask yourself if the scene needs to exist. Or can you deliver the same information by merging it with another scene? Because this is your book and there's no room for boring. If the scene does need to exist and the weather trick doesn't work, start having a look at your other characters and subplots. Is there anything you can add, anyone you can entangle in your story that will add interest without making something unmanageable down the line? If none of the above work, try looking at the characters who are in the scene. Are any of them boring? Sometimes the characters themselves are what's boring. What interesting things do they bring to this situation that might add a new element? If all else fails, write a beta version of your scene. Start in a fresh Word document and answer the question, what is the most interesting thing that could possibly happen in this scene? For this exercise, it does not have to be plot relevant. An explosion, a swarm of bees, the characters kiss. Write the scene that gets your motor going. Then pay attention to what made the difference. Did you end up adding conflict? Did you add a new relationship or damage an old one? How can you harness what your story really needed and make it relevant? For directionlessness, even if you have an outline in hand, you might need to revisit that outlining step and flesh it out a bit more. Again, this is a good time to consider if the scene is actually necessary or if that information can be put elsewhere. If you've followed my series so far, you'll know my outlining process is a long one, and sometimes I get lazy. Or I get sections that are a lot of words without much actionable planning. For example, I might have included a whole bunch of exposition, and then my actionable is just they have a fight on the beach. At a glance, it might look like a scene, there might be enough words there, but there's no actual roadmap for me to follow. The easiest fix is to go back to your outlining phase and sit with the scene. Try to picture it as if it was on TV. What looks good here? What makes most narrative sense? Then flesh out the scene a little better and have another crack. If you get really stuck, ask a friend. They might not know enough about your story to give you a relevant answer, but they might introduce a new idea or prompt you to think of something you might not have thought of on your own. Collaborative storytelling is an extremely powerful tool. Something else that can cause story weakness is your characters acting out of character. Sometimes my characters grow after I've written the outline, or I end up changing the plot. And if you hit a scene where the character's not acting like themselves, it can just feel wrong to write. If your original plot and your current characters are at odds, there are a few things you can do to address it. First off, you can revisit the motivation for the character doing what they're doing in the scene. Is there another, more aligned reason they might be doing what they're doing that would take the jarring nature away from the action? Is there a more fitting action they could take instead that would garner the same result? Could the situation itself be changed to get the desired result with a more suitable action? And could someone else do what needs to be done? As a quick example, let's say we've got a cynical, hard-bitten cop character who's meant to be making friendship bracelets with a little girl. The bracelet is going to be critical later in the story, so we need the action to happen. If the original scene had him making the bracelet because he wanted to, we could change his motivation to trying to keep the little girl quiet. We could also alter the action to have him fiddling with a lighter while the little girl makes the bracelet. We could alter the situation to say he's buying the bracelet for the little girl, or we could say that the child is trying to show him a bracelet that they made. Depending on your story and why the bracelet's critical later, all of these could work. The last reason we're going to talk about that might cause story weakness is a straight up plot hole. Sometimes you can't spot a plot hole until you're in it. Or in this case, standing on the precipice. An example of this from the novel I'm currently writing is a character showing up to deliver critical information when they couldn't physically have been there. They had to be somewhere else. The fix to this one is usually returning to the outline, and while it might be as simple as changing what characters are present or where the scene is taking place, often a plot hole can have a knock-on effect to things happening further down the line, And it's really important to take a high-level, holistic view of your story to make sure it's not going to have a big impact. Plot holes are extremely frustrating, and it can be tempting to ignore them. But I promise you, the earlier in the process you deal with them, the less pain there will be overall. The last thing that can cause a lot of writing fatigue, and I think has been hardest for me to deal with, is hopelessness. When I was 22, I decided that I wanted to try writing. I'd had good grades in high school English, and I'm a creative person, plus I have a background in business. I thought I'd be a great fit for the profession. Writing has been the most humbling thing I've ever done. I'd written 2 books totaling over 160,000 words before I even touched my first publicly available work, Tethered. That's on top of all the writing practice, scene summaries, and of course my lengthy outlining process. Tethered is an okay indie novel. The characters are solid, I still like the story, and the setting is awesome. But the prose needs work. I have some very unsatisfying character deaths in there, and I left it on a terrible cliffhanger with no intention of writing a sequel. 5 works and over 400,000 words later, and I'm still having to overhaul my rough drafts to make good stories. Why am I telling you this? Because writing is an art, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of hard work to do it well. And when you get partway through your manuscript and you look back at your earlier work, it's going to hurt your feelings. Hang in there. It happens to all of us, and it is the only way to get better. In every piece I've ever written, I swing wildly from I love this book, it's the best thing I've ever done, to this is a garbage fire, why am I wasting my time with it? If you let that latter voice win, you'll never get to see your story completed. Trust that it is a phase and that your story is worth finishing. Even if it ends up being a work you don't share, it is a physical representation of how much time, energy, and love you've put into learning a new skill and making yourself even more brilliant than you already are. When you feel like you're not going to be able to finish your rough draft, just remember that the greats started where you are, but they pushed through, they persevered until they became great. You've got this. That kind of turned into a pep talk at the end, but I hope you get the gist. Making time for writing, revisiting your outlines to strengthen your story, and embracing your growth as a writer are 3 ways to actually make it through the process of creating your rough draft. Otherwise, just begin at the beginning. Thank you for watching, and please feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. If you can like and subscribe, it'll make me so happy, and it'll make sure you don't miss the next video. Take care, and until next time, happy writing.